These are the video instructions over the boathouse furniture designed by Sabaku no Shi. This furniture was turned into a quarter scale kit by Bentley House Minis and is now available in the Bentley House Minis store. If you'd like to find out any more information about this kit, including pricing, you can follow the link to the store that's in the description box of this video. Now we can get started on putting everything together. Your kit is going to come with several laser cut shapes, 2 bags of 3D printed pieces, 1 box of 3D printed pieces, and then a smaller bag inside of that box that has some small details. To build our first piece of furniture, you're going to need the laser cut shapes from section 1 and this 3D printed piece that you can see on screen now. Begin by removing the T-shaped piece that is laser cut into your paper and gluing it into the opening as you can see. We are now going to take all of the shapes from the top of section 1 and carefully move them over onto the 3D printed shape. These are going to be your cabinet doors. I'm using a toothpick and a little bit of wood glue to connect them together. These are going to fit perfectly onto the face of your shape. And I'm just going one at a time, making sure I'm happy with how I have it lined up. Once all the shapes are moved over, you should have something that looks like this. You can now set this piece aside to dry. Moving on to piece 2, you're going to need this piece from your 3D printed bag and this section of laser cut shapes. This one is pretty easy to put together. You just have 2 sets of cabinet doors that you can glue into the flat spaces on the face of the 3D printed piece. Once the pieces are added in place, I do find it's easier to use your fingertip to make sure everything is aligned. Once the pieces are in place, it should look like this. This is a unique piece because you can either use it as a cabinet on its side or you can use it as a shelf system sitting vertically. We're now moving on to piece number 3, which has 2 3D printed pieces and 1 set of laser cut shapes. We're going to start with the largest rectangle and cut that out of the laser cut pieces. This is going to be a tabletop and it's going to be glued onto the slanted edge of your 3D printed piece. Center it as best as you can and allow it to dry. Next, we're going to remove the rectangle pieces that are going to act as drawer fronts and glue those onto the front of this piece. The circle needs to be glued into the center of the large rectangle that you previously glued, and then finally you can add some glue on top of the circle and glue the little ship's wheel in place. This is a very unique piece, especially for the boathouse, and I really love how it turns out once it's painted. Now we're going to move on to the kitchenette, which is piece 4, and you will notice that it has 2 different 3D printed pieces and one of them is a wedge. The purpose of this is to flatten out the back of your piece. The angle was specifically made for the angle of the boathouse walls. However, if you want to put it somewhere else, the wedge has been provided for you so that you can have the choice. You may also use this wedge in another way. You can put it against your boathouse walls to create a flat wall if you want to add something else. So this is a very versatile piece, but now we can move on to adding the cabinet doors. The doors are laid out in the same direction that they need to be added onto your 3D printed piece, so I'm carefully going to go one section at a time, adding the cabinet doors. As I go along, I am lining up the pieces with the very top edge of the counter, and I'm just going to carefully get them in place each section before I move on to the next. There's going to be 2 vertical doors, 3 horizontal drawers, and then there's going to be a section of 9 cubes. And of course, you can always use the extra paper that is provided around all of these pieces to cut your own door shapes if you want to. Now that all the doors have been attached, we can move on to making the faucet. I'm going to cut out the 3 J-shaped pieces and glue them to each other, making sure that all the edges are aligned. I'm also going to, at this time, cut out the 4 circles that are going to act as my stovetop. Adding the faucet in place is easiest done with a pair of tweezers because it is so small. I'm going to glue that just at the top of my sink area, and then I'm going to add my stovetop pieces. You can use 3 or 4 or even 2 of these depending how you want your stovetop to look. I'm going to be using 4, and I'm just going to glue those down so that they look even on my stovetop. So now this piece is complete and we can put it to the side to dry. The only step I did not show here is adding the wedge onto the back. If you did want to add this piece to another portion of your boathouse or in another quarter scale project, Now you have a flat back to add it against any wall. Just like the previous piece, piece 5 has two 3D printed pieces, one of them being a wedge, and it also has a sheet of laser cut shapes. The wedge can give you a flat back to your piece of furniture, or you can create a flat wall inside of the boathouse. Once again, you will need to carefully cut your pieces from the laser cut sheet and carefully transfer them onto your piece of furniture as seen in the video. And just go slowly along. They should be in the correct order if you go across the sheet from left to right. Again, you can cut your own size pieces if you want to make something a little bit different. Because this is a rather tall piece, it can be used as a bunk bed or extra storage within your boathouse. You want to add a ladder so your quarter scale people can access the upper deck. I'm going to cut out the two ladder pieces, glue them together so that they are a double thickness, and then line them up with the bottom edge of my furniture. And now that piece is complete. For section 6, you're going to need two 3D printed pieces, one set of laser cut pieces, and one piece of wire from your kit. The wire will be in one of the plastic bags. The laser cut pieces are meant to be shelf inserts for your 3D printed pieces. We're going to start with the L-shaped shelf. I'm adding glue onto the back edge of the shelf insert and gluing it inside. This gives you the freedom to put your shelf insert any place that you like, and you can also leave it out if you want to have a wider shelf, depending on what you want to display. The smaller shelf has two shelf inserts that you can play around with and add anywhere you like. You just want to make sure that as you put them in, your holes are lining up for the next step. Straighten out the wire as best as you can, and we are going to use this as a shelf support. I am first doing a dry fit with my wire to make sure it goes through all of the holes. Be careful not to poke yourself in the finger. And then once I'm happy that everything is lined up, I can add dabs of glue to each hole and push the wire through. I'm trying to line it up with the top of my shelf, and then once it's dry, I'm going to cut off the excess wire. It can kind of fly away, so make sure you're protecting your eyes. I'm going to do this for all three sections where holes are present in my shelf. I'm going to follow the same exact steps for my smaller shelf. It only needs one length of wire to be complete. Again, I'm lining it up with the top edge of my shelf and cutting off the rest at the bottom. Protect your eyes. The designer of this kit originally had these two pieces as one complete piece where they were stacked on top of each other. However, you can use them as separate pieces so that you have shelves in two different portions of your boathouse. It's however you like to use it. They can be used as a lower shelf sitting on the ground or an upper shelf glued up against the ceiling. Section 7 has three identical pieces of furniture. These are going to be 3 chests, and each one is going to be made the same way. I'm starting by removing 2 of the rectangles, and these are going to be glued onto the front flat surface of the chest. Here's how it looks once the 2 pieces are attached. You also have smaller pieces to be used as a lock on the front of the chest. You can add these now, or if you prefer to add them after painting, just make sure you do not lose these pieces. I'm adding first the U shape, and then I'm adding the small rectangle on top of the U shape, pushing it down into the glue. I'm doing the same steps for each of the 3 pieces, and once I'm done, I have 3 chests ready to go into my boathouse. Section 8 is another shelf, but it's done a little bit differently. You're going to need one 3D printed piece, one section with laser cut pieces, and 2 lengths of wire. Again, the laser cut pieces are going to be the shelf inserts. You can put them wherever you like, depending on what you plan to display on the shelf. Once those pieces are inserted, make sure that you lay it flat to dry because these can move easily before the supports are added in. The supports are going to be made out of the 2 wire pieces, and you have both of those wired pieces so you can cut the straightest section out of the wire. Again, be sure to protect your eyes when you're cutting the wire. Once you have a piece that you are happy with, you're going to add glue to the corners of whichever side you're working on, glue it in place, and then remove any of the excess wire with a sharp cutting device. Once you have both of your wires in place to support your shelf, you want to set that aside to dry before painting. Section 9 is probably the easiest pieces to put together because it is a table and small bench. You're going to remove the laser cut rectangles and add them to their coordinating supports. So the smaller rectangle is going to go to the smaller bench supports, and the larger rectangle is going to go to the larger table legs. If you want to have a different tabletop from the table legs, just make sure you paint everything before you glue it together, and that will give a really nice defined line between the top and the bottom of the table. These pieces are made so that the smaller piece is a bench for the table, but it can also be used as a side table or something else, whatever you like. We're now going to move on to the hammocks, which consist of these two 3D printed supports and these laser cut shapes, which are cut out of a thinner paper than the paper we've been using for the cabinet doors. Each shape is going to make one hammock, so once you remove it from the sheet of paper, you're going to bend it in half and fold it so that all of the edges match up. Once it's folded in half, you want to add glue to the bottom edge, the bottom rounded edge on either side of the fold. This is going to connect your hammock together. You want to hold this and make sure that it dries before we move on to the next step, because you could pull your hammock apart if you don't let it dry. I'm adding glue into the small circle openings of the hammock support, and this is going to hold it once we add our hammock in place. I'm adding the pointed edge of one side of my dried hammock piece, and then as I push it in place, I'm using my finger to open it up, and then add the other pointed edge into the opening on the opposite side of the support. This piece is going to be really delicate until it dries, so make sure you put it in a safe place. You're going to make 2 of these total, so you have 2 hammocks for 2 possible residents of your boathouse. The final pieces that you're putting together are made of all 3D printed pieces. It's going to be a spool table with a set of spool stools. You will notice your 3D printed pieces for the top. One side has grooves cut into it like they're little planks of wood, and one side is flat. So whichever side you want to be the top of your table and stools, you want to flip upside down on your work surface because we are going to build them upside down. Next, add some glue to the very top of the pegs and push them into the coordinating tops for your stools and table. The larger peg is going to go into the larger tabletop, and then the moon-shaped stools are going to go into the smaller circles. Once they've dried for a bit, you can flip them back over and you should have a completed table and stool set. And the moon shapes that are at the base of the stools allow them to be pushed up underneath the table. You will notice that you have quite a few little bits and bobs left in your plastic bag, and these are all for the purposes of decoration. You can use the shields around the outside of your boathouse if you want to add some kind of insignia or initials. You have an extra ship's wheel, and you have a bunch of smaller shapes that could possibly be cans of food or boxes of some kind. Here are all the different pieces of furniture, unpainted, that can be made from the Boathouse Furniture Kit. I will give you a few tips on painting. You will notice right away that your 3D printed pieces are going to take paint differently from the paper laser cut pieces. My advice is to use very thin coats of paint and build them up over time, and eventually you will get an even coat over both types of material. If you do find that the paint fills in the gaps between your cabinet doors, I suggest using a sharp craft knife to redefine those edges. I like to do a little bit of dry brushing. I feel like it brings out some of the detail of the pieces, but it is definitely not necessary. You will find at the very edge of your kit you have several thin pieces of paper that are laser cut, and these are great as handles. I do want to tell you that if you are cutting these incredibly small, the paper can delaminate, which means come apart in different layers. So if you want to keep that from happening from the beginning, you can run a small amount of glue over the edges of these thin pieces of paper before cutting them apart. Once you've cut them into tiny handles, whatever length you would like, you can use a small amount of glue and a toothpick to add them to the face of your pieces of furniture. These details are what really start to bring these pieces to life. And you can either paint the strips of paper before you cut them apart, but if you're not sure what paint you want to use, I have found that a very small ball stylus was just what I needed to paint the very small areas that were the handles after they were attached to the face of my furniture. So once it's done, I have a piece that's looking like this, and then I will show you a few other pieces. I also used the small handle strips to create the faucet controls on either side of the faucet. And you can really do all sorts of different things with these pieces of furniture. There's many different ways to customize them, especially this piece can be turned into a bunk bed. You can fill in these cabinets with all sorts of either clothing or boxes, whatever the crew needs to be storage. And again, this piece can function as a vertical shelf on its own, or because it's the exact same length as the kitchenette, you can create it into a kitchen cabinet that goes above it inside of your boathouse. So there's so many different ways to make this boathouse furniture set your own, with the way you paint it, with the way you add the handles. You can even change up the cabinetry however you want. And I will show you how these pieces fit inside of the boathouse so you can see how much room it takes up inside of the house itself. Here is how everything looks together. As you can see, it does fill it up pretty well. However, there's still room where you can add your own pieces and your own story. If you are interested in the boathouse as well, you can also find that on bentleyhouseminis.com. You can see both the listing for the furniture, which is separate and contains all of these pieces, and the boathouse, which is a separate listing. A 1/48 scale figure is not included with the furniture or the house, but I did want to add it into this video so you can see how a person would compare to these pieces of furniture and to the interior of the boathouse itself. Thank you for watching the instructional video over the boathouse furniture set designed by Sabaku no Shi. If you want to find out any more information about this set or any other kits sold by Bentley House Minis, you can visit the link in the description box below. Bye!